What is up, guys, and welcome to another PLO hand review, where we are going to analyze some of the interesting hands that I've played, talking through some important PLO concepts, and also showing you how I go about reviewing hands. Make sure you subscribe below to stay up to date with our latest content, and also check out PLOpokercoaching.com for in-depth articles on all areas of Pot Limit Omaha. And if you're interested in a free 30-minute consultation, coaching session to evaluate your game and develop a strategy to improve it, make sure you reach out to us and we will be happy to set that up. So yeah, let's jump into a hand played here on Ignition at 1-2. We are reviewing a hand where we raised in the cutoff and got called out of the button. And I would advise, when you're studying your game, make sure you look at it in spots. So like here, I've been working on recently single raise pots out position, specifically when I check call the flop and move on to turn transitions. This allows you to really get deep into the spot and understand the more general concepts that apply, rather than just running through the biggest hands that you lost in a session and just checking if you kind of got the hand right, for example. So first thing when we get to this flop is we want to decide if we're going to c-bet, and if we're going to c-bet, what sizing would we use? And to sort of break that down, what I always look at is equity and polarity advantage, the SPR in the situation, what position we're in, and then the board texture. So on this particular board, we want to figure out if we have an equity or polarity advantage. And we have kind of that uncapped wider range from the cutoff that we're opening versus the button that has a capped range, but it's a much stronger condensed range that's going to be calling us. So usually on most boards that aren't as high, we're going to have a relatively even equity distribution, and it's going to be pretty competitive. So not much of an equity advantage on this board. And then if we're talking about the polarity advantage, well, we shouldn't really have a polarity advantage on this board because most of Button's kind of cold calling range is going to consist of Broadway pairs. So almost 25% of his overall range is going to be like kings, queens, those sorts of hands. So he will actually have a slight polarity advantage on this board. And we can see that if we look at a Munker sim and we pull up the equity graph for this particular spot. You can see here that overall equities run pretty close, and that the button will actually have a slight polarity advantage. So no real reasons that we want to be betting in this situation from an equity or polarity advantage. So the next thing I would go down to is what's the SPR, and the SPR here is over 10. So that is going to mean that our positional disadvantage at a high SPR is going to be more significant. So we have to play these boards more cautiously at higher SPRs. And then I would look at the texture and say, okay, well, this board is very dynamic. There's going to be a lot of nut changing turns and rivers that we're going to have to deal with out of position on each street. So if you factor all of those things in, this leads to us basically checking our entire range on a board like this. So we do go ahead and check, and we face a pot size bet. And, this is an interesting sizing, first of all. But, with our particular hand, and before we get to that, we want to think about, well, what are we going to raise with in this situation, and what are we going to call with? So our kind of value check raising range, right, is mainly going to be built around top set and combo draws, and our bluffs will have similar cards that are going to mirror that, right? So if we look at our particular hand, we have pretty medium draws, we have a gut shot, we have a second nut flush draw. So it falls somewhere in between, right? It's kind of too weak to raise for value, but it's too strong to fold, and it's, also too strong to kind of turn into a bluff at this point because we have decent equity. If we had a hand like no flush draw here, just the Jack of Hearts with a king blocker, that would be something that we would potentially look to turn into a bluff. This is somewhat of a marginal call against a pot size bet, but I think that this is fine. And we do go ahead and get the ace of hearts on the turn. And when we're looking at turn transitions, when we check call the flop, there's not going to be many that we have a significant leading range on, because we did cap ourselves on the flop by not check raising, so our opponent is going to have the polarity advantage on most turns. Now, that's a little bit different when we have nut changing turns, so if the straight comes in or the flush comes in, we are going to have more leads. On the flush card, we'll have a decent amount of leads. However, this is a special case scenario where the nut flush card is actually turned on this street. So when we are thinking about the ranges that are in play, most of the flushes that imposition is going to be betting on the flop are going to be stronger flushes. They're going to include nut flushes. Otherwise, he's likely going to be checking back, right? And the flushes that we are going to have in our range, we didn't check raise the flop. So we're going to have less nut flushes in our range and more medium to weaker flush draws. So this actually skews the distribution of flushes if we look at the turn sim here, and we just look at the overall heart distribution. We're going to have flushes in our range 28% of the time, whereas imposition is only going to have about 16% of flushes. So this gives us actually a really large, sorry if you take the filter off, this gives us a very large equity and polarity advantage on this turn. So you can see that we have like 65% equity on this turn card, and it's going to lead to us having an over 50% lead frequency here. So now we kind of have to decide on what sort of sizing that we want to use, given that we know we're betting over 50% of our range. So the jack high flush is most likely going to make it into that range. And now we sort of want to start looking at, do we block pairs to the board, right? So hands that our opponent is going to lead on the flop are going to be things like king, king, queen, queen, and we unblock those hands. So I think we definitely do want to bet, and it is relatively close between a half pot size bet and a pot size bet, and I did elect to go for the half pot size bet here. My gut was kind of thinking that I was against kings, and given that the straight and flush did just turn, I did want to keep those hands in with a smaller bet sizing. So I do go half pot. We do get called, and at this point again, our opponent eliminates a lot more of his queen high flushes. One, he wouldn't have necessarily been betting them as much on the flop, but now again on the turn here, he should be raising a decent amount of his queen high flushes, and he just flat calls. So now we're basically kind of have the nuts in most scenarios, and we get this blank river, which is beautiful, and we just need to decide now on how much we're gonna bet. So are we going to bet small, or are we going to bet large? And this is where the blockers become really important. We have options to use both sizings. So if we bet the turn and we get called and we get this blank river, you'll see that we still maintain that large equity and large polarity advantage. So in the top 30% of the range, we still have a big polarity advantage, but we're also being these sort of weaker hands here, which are kind of like the sets and straights that our opponent might have. So it is split between a smaller sizing and a large sizing. And if we now think about what we actually want to target in that range of our opponent, whether we want to target the top end of his range or the bottom end of his range, it's mostly going to come down to whether we think he has a weaker flush or whether he has a set. So when we're looking at the sizing that we want to use, if we are making it more likely that our opponent has a set, then we are going to bet bigger. So if we have hearts, and let's say that we don't have an ace, king, or queen, you can see that we are going for this large sizing of most of our range, to be honest, because we make it very likely that our opponent has a set. Whereas if we do have, let's say, a king, which is going to be the most important blocker here, because top set is the most likely hand that our opponent pots on the flop. If we do have a king, then now we see that we really do have this very large sizing, right? Because we are blocking top set pretty much completely. Whereas if we have no king, we are going to size down and use a little bit of a smaller sizing here. So once we get to this decision, our particular hand is close, and it does mix. We can kind of do both things here. I elected to go for the smaller sizing just because I did think that my opponent would have the set here most of the time, and potentially we could have gone for a pot size bet exploitatively here, but I think that the sizing is fine. We do get called, and our opponent does show down the 10 high flush, so we obviously missed out on some value, but don't want to be results oriented. I think that we broke the hand down pretty well in game, and realized the value of unblocking those sets to go for the smaller sizing. Well, so that's it for me, guys, and thanks for tuning in, and make sure you're diving into study sessions after you play to keep improving your game. All right, good luck at the tables, everybody.